Well, that's pretty good. I got exactly what I wanted off. So this is a bit of a landscape to sort out, isn't it? Lots of little shapes, problems and twists to deal with. And I thought to make it a little bit easier on you, what I'll do is I'll nap away at this. And at the same time I nap it, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story I made up myself about the beginning of the last ice age. So sit yourselves back and listen to a story. It's a story in progress, and I'll turn this into a dagger if I can. So you need to wind your mind back many, many thousands of years, and there was a small family living in a reasonable sized cave. There's a mother, a father and a son. The son's name was Finn, and Finn used to like getting up early in the mornings and going hunting. His dad was a good hunter when it came down to big game, but Finn was still a boy. He was only about 12 years old, and consequently, you know what 12-year-olds are like. They've always been the same, and way back then it was no different in some respects, apart from the fact the boy was always outside. They had a great place. They lived in a valley, and at the bottom of this valley was a river. And outside the cave they had a big stone terrace, and there were several avenues down to the river, and Finn had his favourite, and along the way there was many traps set up. Now, young Finn felt quite important as a young man, because he was capable of bringing a lot of the food home. It wasn't always necessary to be going out and catching big deer and roaming around and showing what a great hunter he was with big animals. A lot of what they ate was small. Anyway, a few things that were going on right at the moment is winter had been a long autumn, and the beginning of the winter had been particularly harsh. In fact, Finn had never remembered a winter that felt quite like it. He'd had to have some new clothes made out of reindeer skin, and he'd even started turning them inside out so that the fur was on his skin. That way, there was much less room for air to travel around inside his clothing, and kept him much warmer. And in the evenings, they would sit around the fire, huddled together in skins as well, chewing on some of the dried meats that they'd cured over the fire. And quite often Finn would be the first to sleep, because he was such a busy, active boy. And that meant that he always got up first, and he didn't mind, because what he'd do is he'd gently tiptoe out of the cave, making sure that he hadn't woken his parents, because his father never used to take kindly to that, nor did his mother or sister, to be honest. And on his way out, he'd grab his little backpack, because he needed something to put in there, anything that he might be needing. He'd also pick up his sling and his bow and his arrow, and take a few dried fruits so that he had something to nibble along the way. So on this particular morning, he went out and he stood on the terrace, and he could see that the sun was in the sky, and the mist was beginning to rise off of all of the plants, and it looked like it was going to be a good morning. So during the week, Finn had been setting up some traps, and he decided he was going to go out of the cave to the left, through into some gorse bushes, and look around underneath the gorse bushes and see if any of his traps had activated and caught any birds, or any small sort of vermin-y style creatures. So off he went, and this was a winding, meandering slope that went on down towards the river. And the first trap he came across, there had been no activity at all. So he just adjusted it a little bit, put a little bit more bait out, and then carried on his way. On the second one that he came to, the actual trap had been released, but there was nothing in it. So it took him a little while, and he had to take care when he was setting a trap, because he was using a power system, and if you got it wrong, you could give yourself a nasty little nip. So he pulled down the branch, reset the toggle, rebaited it, had a look to see why it had failed, and basically the wind had blown the snare over to one side a little bit, so it had been ineffective. So what he tried to do was move the grass around a little bit to stop the wind getting to it. He carried on, and then he started coming out into a birch forest, and he was looking around to see what kind of fungi there might be. But the trouble is, the ground was fairly heavily frozen over. In some places there was quite a bit of snow, so it was quite hard to see anything on the ground that he might be using. And to be quite honest, the berries that he'd been enjoying from the bushes, they'd pretty much all now gone past. Some even just hung there in little black clusters, but not much of an edible use. So he pressed on. One of the things that he did pick was a birch polypore, because he knew that he could use that as a plaster, or he could actually, if they get stomach aches, then what they could do is they'd slice it up and boil it up, and then actually use that to help out stomach aches and parasites. So quite often they're working with dirty hands, and they didn't have hygiene rules and laws like we do these days. How you doing so far? Right, back to the action. Anyway, so Finn thought to himself, well, what he would do is, as he was passing through the snowy patches, he would look for footprints, and he would look for little yellow stains, and try and get some observation of activity of deer that he could tell his dad about, because this is all important stuff, knowing what the trends and the actions of the deer were. But to his dismay, there was nothing to report. He saw nothing, and so he headed on down to the river. Now the river was a great place. It was a place that was full of memories, because it was where they washed, they swam, they set traps up into the river, and the traps were nearly always teeming with fish. Life was good, and so this was something that the whole family had learnt to rely upon. And he made his way down, and well, basically the river was frozen solid. He had a little boat, skin boat. He couldn't budge it because it was frozen into the water, and their little willow baskets that were in the river that would normally be full of fish were frozen solid, and he could see quite a bit of damage. So Finn thought to himself, if I try and move anything, all I'm going to do is I'm going to break it more. So he thought he'd move along the river a little bit and see if he could find any little pools, and maybe throw some bait into the pools and see if he can entice some fish into them areas. But as he began to move along, he heard something. He heard some movement from on the other side of the river. high up on the bank. Now this was fairly unusual in some respects, because it sounded like human, and they didn't see a lot of other humans. And there was reasons for that, because there was a kind of agreement between families and tribes that they would space out a bit, because if too many of them got together, the animals kind of moved further away, and it made the whole sequence of hunting a little bit harder. And high up on the ridge, Finn could see 5 or 6 people moving along into what was quite clearly Finn's family territory. And they looked down, they saw him, and they made some hand gestures. And the hand gestures that they were making meant that they were sorry to be trespassing on his land, but also that they were just passing through, and would be gone shortly. So Finn kind of looked quizzically at them, waved back, and everybody passed by. So far this morning, things weren't working out too well. All he'd got was a razor strop birch polypore, and he's starting to feel a bit disgruntled, because his family always showed him great joy when he came in with the food for the morning. So anyway, Finn had a little place that he used to throw bits and pieces of dead carcass. And he did that because what it did is it encouraged the flies to come, and lots of maggots would be in this place. He had to smash the top a little bit because the ground was frozen, but soon he came into this big maggoty pool, and he heaved a load of them out and then dropped them into a little bit of the water that he'd been able to smash the ice away from. And he sat there calmly, and he took out what looked like an arrow, but it wasn't quite. On this one, it had a piece of string attached to it, and it had a tip that was made out of antler in the shape of a harpoon. And he carefully sat there waiting, patiently, just like a heron. The perfect fisherman. This is what his dad had always taught him to do, not move in a muscle. And he sat there for 15 minutes, and lo and behold, a big fish came in and started nibbling away at the maggots. And Finn struck with a deadly blow, and his harpoon arrow went straight through the side of the fish. And then what he did is, as he pulled, the arrow was released, and on the end of this piece of string, with a toggle-like piece of antler on the end, he had his fish. And a smile came to his face, and he knew that he could go back and feed everyone that morning. So that's what he begun to do. He decided he'd take a new path on the way back, which would take him up for a new territory, and he could keep on looking for animal footprints and signs, and see just exactly what was about. As he moved up, he was moving up through hazel plantations, which they quite often trimmed short because it gave them straight arrows. But he was leaving them at the moment. He wanted to let them overwinter because they'd harden up a little bit, and then he could cut these in the spring. And but he moved on through, and then to his joy, he found one of his sprung traps sprung with a ptarmigan in there, and that was tightly held round the neck, and it had been suspended off of the ground, the type of trap that he'd used, so stray foxes and badgers couldn't come along and steal it off him. So what he did is he pulled on the noose, pulled it down, and released the bird. And he had a little belt round his waist which had little toggles, so he fastened the head through a toggle, hung it on his waist, and carried on his way back home, feeling somewhat more pleased with himself now. So when he got back to the cave, he could see a little bit of smoke rising out of the entrance, so he knew that his parents had got up now. And he went in there, and his father and mother were sitting by the fire, just basically keeping warm, and they were delighted to see him come in with a big fresh fish and a fresh bird. And his sister wanted to get involved in the plucking of the bird, so Finn was quite happy to give her that job. And she sat there, and what she did while she plucked it is she started separating the feathers out. And all of these small downy feathers, she was keeping them to one side because she liked to stick them into her boots, and this would keep her feet nice and warm. And then she was using all of the other feathers that would have been good on the back of arrows and separating them out and cleaning them so they'd stay good and not get infected by insects. Dad sat there with his mum. The mum took the fish and she poured from a vessel made out of a deer's stomach some fresh water into a ground out rock that they used, and then what she did is she began to descale the fish and gut it as well. She put the guts to one side because what they were going to do is they would boil them down and make some glue. And Finn sat there and he began to talk to his dad about the journey he'd had that morning. And it wasn't too long before he said to his dad about the tribe of people that he'd seen moving on the other side of the river through the valley heading east. It was at this point when he looked across at his dad, and his dad was a warrior, strong, lived through many years of Stone Age life and seen many things. He noticed a flicker in the corner of his dad's face and a distant look in his eyes that generally was never there. And he picked up on this because he read his dad's face like a book, and he said, "What is it? What's wrong?" And his dad said, "Well, son," he said, "we're going to have to follow them people that you saw this morning, and we'll be leaving in 2 days." So his son said to him, Why? We've always lived here. We've painted on the walls. This is where we come from. Where are we going?" And his dad said, "Away from the ice." He said, "Have you not noticed that no big animals are here? They've already moved." And he said, "A long winter's coming, which will completely close the front of the cave off. And that means that we wouldn't survive. Our only chance is to move east. And we will be gone for maybe many months or many years. We may even never return." And so consequently, they started having the discussion about the things that they would be able to take. And Finn had many things, but he knew they were never all going to fit into his backpack. Some of the things were toys that he'd made when he'd been carving out of bones, like images of deer swimming across the lakes. There were lots of clothes that he used through different seasons, but his dad told him he wouldn't be able to take them all and they'd have to make new ones, which he didn't like the idea of at all, because some of the clothes he made took him hundreds of hours, and he added on to them as he went. And then there was also all of the stores of the food that they gathered throughout the seasons, which they had quite a bit, enough to get them through the winter. But absolutely no way would they be able to carry all of that. They were going to be able to carry maybe a month's worth of food at the most. The best food that they could carry was meat that they dried and then stored in fat, then wrapped up in rawhide so that it was locked away and would store very safely. So as you can imagine, that particular evening, as the day came to the end and Finn was settling down to go to sleep, he was looking at the reflection of all of the paintings on the walls and still marvelling at the way these paintings danced when the flames moved over their surfaces, because they'd picked shapes on the walls that captured shadows and gave a movement that really took some thinking through. But his dad had taught him to be a great artist, and even the paints that they'd used, they'd taken them from deep within caves, a rock called ochre, although his dad called it blood of Mother Earth. And Finn lay there, not just feeling quite sad, but also quite anxious about the future, because there was a safety here. The people for 30 miles in every direction knew their cave, they knew their land, and they knew how they all fitted in. And the whole idea of finding somewhere brand new, as good as this, could be a very bleak situation. You don't even have the safety of the cave at night, so they're going to be out in the open wilderness with the wild animals. But eventually Finn did fall into slumber and began to go to sleep. Phew. Right. So we're this far so far. We've levelled it, and now what I've got to do is try and slowly bring this down, thin it out, and see if we can make a dagger. But that's enough for this episode. I think what I'll do is we'll let this roll out, see what you guys think about the story, see if you want to watch episode 2, and you can comment and like and share about that to motivate me to give you episode 2.